everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of the History Hotline. My name is Deanna Lynn Cook and I am your host today. Today's episode is going to be about Queen Nanny of the Maroons, the Maroon leader of Jamaica who freed thousands of slaves from the British and also led rebellions against the British. And, you know, Maroon Town still exists in Jamaica today. So if that legacy doesn't tell you enough, then stay tuned for this episode because we'll be discovering more about Queen Nanny. And before we go into, the episode and more about the Maroons, firstly, as a people and as a culture, and then into Nanny and what she did in Jamaica, we're going to give a shout out to another charity that is doing the work for women, as it is still Women's History Month this week. I think following on from last week where I said the charity Reclaim the Streets was to be donated to following what was happening in Britain with Sarah Everard and her murder and the situation in Clapham. However, following on from the vigil in Clapham, where those organisers of that movement, decided not to then go to the vigil because of the fines that were going to be dished out by the police, and leaving women that had been, I think, in a way led to believe that this vigil would be a safe space for them to go to that vigil and they would not be there as leaders, where you have movements such as Sisters Uncut who were there and have been doing tremendous work in the past 2 weeks to protest against the police crackdown bill, which will basically not allow us to protest or have the right to protest freely. We will have to have, a special grant which would be requested at the Home Secretary Priti Patel's command. And I don't really want to be in that position. And Sisters Uncut have been doing the work in this past week. They've been protesting outside of Parliament and they haven't stopped putting pressure on the government, and the police crackdown bill has actually been delayed. Obviously it's not a victory and they've said it's not a victory, but they won't stop until they kill the bill, essentially. We have to increase the resistance and we have to build a movement. And I just think it's interesting again that women are doing this work. Not to say that it's only women, but having a movement that's born out of something that started with violence towards women, not just Sarah Everard, but black women, Asian women. There is a lot of violence at the moment in society that is being highlighted by the media. To have this group doing the groundwork, doing the labour in order to make us have a better future where we are able to protest about the things that we don't agree with in society. We live in a democracy, so for our right to protest to be taken away is absolutely atrocious. And they are doing this work, so I would say, donate to them or just raise awareness, I think, when it comes to this police crackdown bill. This bill has to be killed. In this podcast alone, we've looked at so many instances of where protest has led to success and justice, the Mangrove 9 case, the Brockwell 3, just to name two. But we rely on protests, I think, especially in black communities, to have our voices heard. Protest is the voice of the marginalised and the silenced. And I think it's really important that that's not taken away. So Sisters Uncut is the organisation that I will be highlighting this week in Women's History Month for the work that they are doing and have been doing, not just this week and last week because of the bill, but the work that they've been doing historically has been incredible. So I will put their details on my socials if you would like to donate or raise awareness or do what you can for this organisation and movement. Okay, so as I said, today's episode will be about Queen Nanny of the Maroons. Now, I think if you're Jamaican or know anything about Jamaican history, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about because Queen Nanny is literally on the money. A $500 bill in Jamaica is called a nanny, and her legacy is very clear in Jamaica. She's the only female national hero. Jamaica's only national heroine, and she is revered in that country, I would say. And that legacy has been long in its creation and building because the respect and reverence for her has not always been there. However, it's there now, and I feel like she's probably one of the most respected women in Jamaican history. Of course, there are others, but, she's the first one that comes to mind when I think about Jamaica. Now, Queen Nanny was an African woman. She was born in West Africa in the region of Ghana, or that would now be called Ghana. And with Queen Nanny, there are kind of two versions, I'd say, to every story about her life. Because African history is traditionally passed down through, an oral tradition, it's spoken and not necessarily written. Sometimes there can be 2 or 3 versions of a story, and I don't want you to think that reduces the validity of any story, because I think the same point still stands. And in this case, that she was a great military leader and she was a great resistor of British imperialism, even in a country that, wasn't necessarily hers. And I think despite the fact that there might be 2 versions of most events, because when I've done this research, I have tapped into oral histories as well. I've watched videos of people in Jamaica speaking about Queen Nanny, of tour guides, and of things that I've been told growing up as a Jamaican in Britain, from family members in Jamaica, uncles, aunts, from what they've had to say about Queen Nanny. These are the traditions that are passed down and have been taken from Africa to the Caribbean and to us in Britain. And I think sometimes in academia, oral histories are often said to be not as valid or not real history. And I would like to push back against that idea. And so today I didn't read any books for this episode. I relied solely on oral histories, except for one section of this podcast where I am going to read an extract from a book that I read a while back, because it is very relevant, I think, and does really summarise I think the legacy of Nanny more so than any stories about her life. And so I just wanted to stress the importance of the traditions of oral history in this podcast, especially when we are looking at African and Caribbean history in the early days. And I also want to say that just because there might be 2 versions of events for some of the events that I speak about, it doesn't denote or detract from Nanny's greatness and Queen Nanny's legacy. So the first point that has 2 questionable potential stories is the fact that Queen Nanny was definitely born from the region of Ghana in around 1868. However, whether she was from the Akan ethnic group or the Ashanti ethnic group is unknown, but definitely a Ghanaian ethnic group. And I think most people do say the Ashanti group, and she was brought to Jamaica during the transatlantic slave trade. So again, it's not really sure. We're not sure whether she was kidnapped, although most people say she was kidnapped alongside her brothers and brought as an enslaved woman to the island of Jamaica. However, some people have argued that she came freely, as a free woman, that is. But then the questions of whether, how she would have got to Jamaica freely and why she would have gone to Jamaica freely are questionable. I think it's very much more likely that she was enslaved and found her freedom on the island when she rebelled with her brothers and escaped. So before I get into Queen Nanny's story, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jamaican history, not too much, because if you've listened to the Ray and Nephew episode, you'll remember that we went into quite a lot of depth with the history of colonial Jamaica, it being colonised by the Spanish first and then the British later. But we're going to talk about Maroon history, because there weren't just Maroons in Jamaica, and the Maroons were a community of people of the Ashanti ethnic group in Ghana that were moved to Caribbean islands and the Americas as well, the southern states in America, through the transatlantic slave trade. So the Maroons, as we've said, they were enslaved Africans, and they often escaped from their colonisers, and in the early days it would have been the Spanish. They escaped their captors, and they would often set up their own communities in the woods or forests of the islands that they were on, or they would link with the indigenous peoples already on the island, so the Arawaks or the Tanos, who were there prior to the Spanish or the British, and who actually, were the original inhabitants of the Caribbean, Jamaica, not all the Caribbean islands, but primarily Jamaica. So the Maroons were called the Maroons because they were secluded from outsiders, i.e. marooned, and they often hid in forests and caves in Jamaica and on Caribbean islands. Maroon communities actually were across the Caribbean, in Haiti, there were Maroons, and actually their rebellion preceded the Haitian Revolution. Many years before that, it was their resistance that also led to kind of the possibility of the Haitian Revolution in some ways. There were Maroons in Cuba, St. Vincent, Puerto Rico, Dominica, Guyana, Panama, Suriname and Colombia, and I think there were a lot of links between the Maroons in Suriname and the Maroons in Jamaica. There were also Maroons in Mexico and along the Amazon River Basin to the southern United States, in Florida and the Carolinas. So these Maroon communities were popping up in many different islands and in the Americas as well, and they just were simply rebelling and resisting colonial rule and escaping their captors so that they could be free. And, you know, these communities obviously were built on community values. You know, they had to look out for one another. They are fighting a common enemy and antagonising a common enemy. Planters and enslaved plantation owners were scared of the Maroons in Jamaica, especially because they knew that they knew the land way better than they as colonisers would ever know it. They had specific military training and tactics that they were passed on from, you know, their time in Africa, obviously being Africans, and also the fact that they, you know, had nothing to lose really as Maroons. They were simply trying to be free and also trying to free as many people as possible, but they also had to survive. And we're going to talk about some of their survival stories and tactics afterwards, but because of their desire and need to survive, primarily finding food, they would often raid plantations. They would often go there and take the food and take people if possible, if they could free them. So, you know, they were really antagonising these planters, and they were really not just resisting and rebelling, but they were also kind of attacking in some ways. But they were skillful warriors and skillful fighters, and Queen Nanny is no exception. On most islands and in most places, as I said, the Maroons were warriors and fighters. Colonisers often try to starve them out of existence by implementing kind of like famines or trying to cut off their food supplies. However, the Maroons continued to grow their population by bringing in other enslaved people who had escaped or helping them escape. Going to plantations, as I said, raiding their food supplies, harassing the planters, who really did fear the Maroons. That is definitely not to be underestimated. In the case of the British, when they eventually came to fight the Spanish and then colonised Jamaica, Francis Drake, he enlisted the Maroons actually due to their knowledge of the land when fighting the Spanish. Now, you might be thinking, well, why did the Maroons help him? Well, the Spanish as colonisers were awful, and they were one of the most brutal empires. When we think about people being enslaved and the treatment of them, not to say any other colonisers were better per se, but they were especially brutal, the Spanish. And the Maroons, you know, started their fight against the Spanish. That was their first battle because that was who they were enslaved by initially. And so they helped the British fight the Spanish for Jamaica and for control of that. And whilst you might be thinking, well, why did they do that? That's not a question I can answer, to be quite honest. However, I think just understanding how brutal the Spanish were, I think they would have just wanted some kind of change, potentially. A lot of the Maroon communities were vanquished on the other islands and they were wiped out overall, just like the native people, for the most part, were also wiped out. However, in Jamaica, they did really stand strong and steadfast, and specifically because of the environment in Jamaica and the land layout is not very easily accessible from the outside. So if you think of Jamaica as a really small island, and then you think of the coast being obviously all around the island where ships would come in, trade would happen on those coastal areas, but then the internal parts of the island are very hilly, they're very mountainous, and they're very difficult to navigate if you don't know where you're going. And so from the outside, to get into the interior of the island would have been very difficult. It would have been very isolating, and it wouldn't be something you could do in vehicles. So these colonisers would have to go there, if they tried to, on foot, holding their weapons, which would have been heavy because this wasn't sophisticated weaponry that we have today. And so that alone would have tired them out. And then they would have been going against the Maroons, who know the land really well, who can set traps, who can hide out, who can, preempt their attacks. And so that living situation for the Maroons led them to be quite an autonomous community and a constant threat to the British once they had taken over from the Spanish, because Britain simply didn't have a clue. You've got to think about all these colonisers colonising these countries and islands. They actually don't even know what the islands look like or the countries look like. They've never even been to the entirety of these islands and these regions, yet they think they can have the power. And they did manage to take power and colonise these whole countries and land masses. It's absolutely insane to me, but I think the Maroon resistance in Jamaica is something that should always be known and taught, because it's just so interesting and so different to the narrative that we are often fed, that these countries and islands were colonised. And until this day, the Maroon community in Jamaica do not fall under the jurisdiction of Jamaica, because when Jamaica got their independence, the Maroons had already sorted out a treaty with the British. Sorry, this is a bit of a spoiler. It's meant to be at the end of the episode. But they had a treaty with the British that said they were to be autonomous, one set of Maroons anyway. We'll get on to what happened to the other Maroons later. But yeah, even to this day, they aren't really under the Jamaican government. They deal with things as a community and as an isolated and autonomous group of people in Jamaica. So, as I've mentioned, Queen Nanny of the Maroons, of the Jamaican Maroons, was born in West Africa in the region of Ghana in 1686, allegedly of the Ashanti ethnic group. And I think this is probably the most likely because of the traditions that she followed and passed on were of the Ashanti people. She was captured with her brothers and sent to Jamaica, formerly known at the time as Santiago under the Spanish. And then when the British invaded and captured Jamaica, it was renamed as Jamaica. As I've said, there were the Arawak and Tonos people, who were the indigenous people there. And once Nanny and her brothers actually had escaped from the plantation that they were put on to work in St. Thomas, she found herself a free woman, not legally free, but free, and working alongside the indigenous people to form independent communities. So, as I've said, her and her brothers escaped. They managed to escape their area of St. Thomas, where the plantation was, and they escaped to an area now called the Blue Mountains, which are a little bit north of the parish of St. Thomas. And it sparked actually the beginning of rebellions across the island. So, Queen Nanny and her brothers escaped. Her brothers were called Kujo, Johnny, Akompong, and Kwao. And they all settled in different areas, actually, of Jamaica and formed different Maroon communities because they realised that they couldn't all be in one kind of Maroon group. They had to keep the communities small and many because, there would be more chance of them being able to find other enslaved people that needed to join them or to raid other plantations and not have everyone's cover blown. If one person got caught, the idea was that nobody else would get caught. It would be only that person, unfortunately. But these were few and far between. And I'm going to tell you about the First Maroon War in 1720. Queen Nanny, having settled in the area called the Blue Mountains, a town that was later given the name Nanny Town. It had a really great strategic location because it overlooked Stony River, which had about a 270 metre ridge, which is about 900 feet. So a surprise attack from the British couldn't really happen because they had the vantage point in terms of overlooking the area that they were inhabiting. And so for the Maroons, Nanny's obviously a hero and a leader, a spiritual leader, a military leader and a community leader. And I use the term community quite loosely because we're not thinking about community in the way we think about it in maybe Britain or in the Western world. I think in the context of the Maroons in the Caribbean, it is slightly different. So, the British, they captured Nanny Town on many occasions, but they could never hold it. Because of the guerrilla warfare tactics that the Maroons would use, they couldn't beat them. They waged successful wars against British colonial forces over a decade. This was a long-standing battle because the Maroons would simply not back down. Their resistance was so strong and they were so adamant in it that they were to be free, that they could not simply be captured by the British. So Nanny Town was eventually abandoned because obviously for part of, the Maroons are constantly under attack, it might be time to move on and inhabit a new area of the island. The Windward Maroons in the Windward area is a part of Jamaica. They are now under the command of Nanny, but they moved to New Nanny Town. And so between 1728 and 1734, during that first Maroon War, which obviously the Maroons won, you don't ever hear about the Maroon Wars, do you? Because Britain didn't win. Other Maroon settlements, and there were many, because as I've said, her four brothers all set up different Maroon areas, and there were also, pre-existing Maroon settlements and areas across the island. They were often attacked, obviously, and sometimes, the Maroons would win. Normally the Maroons would win, especially the Maroons under Nanny. According to some accounts, in 1733, many Maroons of Nanny Town actually travelled across the island to unite with the Leeward Maroons. In 1734, a Captain Stoddart attacked the remnants of Nanny Town, which was situated on one of the highest mountains on the island, so the only path available was really steep, really rocky and really difficult. Literally not wide enough for two people to walk abreast. It was so narrow and so steep. So that ravine, which was kind of like a cockpit, the Maroon used like decoys to trick the British into ambushes. They would just wrap themselves up in leaves and in nature so that they could blend in with the surroundings and jump out and attack the British, luring them into a false sense of security. Maroons could run into the view of British and into the direction of fellow Maroons who were hidden and then would attack. And so the British kept failing these ambushes and losing, and many British generals were killed by the Maroons in their failed attacks. And so they eventually retaliated. And whilst there are records from planters and colonisers on the island that would say that, the British military people and the captains they were getting the Maroons, they'd killed few. The numbers were only always in single digits, whereas, the Maroons actually freed around 1,000 enslaved people. And you might be thinking, oh, that's not a lot. But when you understand the size of Jamaica as an island being so small, those numbers are monumental. Eventually, I think the British forces on the island actually just decided to stop trying to fight them. And I think they realised that they could actually use them to help them protect themselves from an attack from the Spanish or the French, who again were big colonisers in the region. The French having colonised islands like Haiti, Martinique, and the Spanish Cuba. And so the British decided that instead of fighting them, they could use them. And so they proposed treaties with the Maroons. Now, as I've said, there's several Maroon groups across the island. Queen Nanny is in charge of one of them, and her brothers are leaders of some of the other ones. So in 1739, the British signed a treaty with Cudjoe, and this, allowed them then to kind of barter with the other Maroons with less favourable treaties, because they kind of realised that, we've got one now. And so that treaty was followed by a treaty with the Windward Maroons in 1740. The British governor of Jamaica signed that treaty alongside with them, and that was Cow, who was in charge of those Maroons, and he later became a leader of Crawfordstown. So the treaties basically... Those treaties specifically didn't make mention of how much land would be allocated to the Maroons. These treaties were basically acknowledging the Maroons as independent and free people on the island. However, they also meant that the Maroons could no longer help runaway slaves, and they had to turn them in and also help capture any runaway slaves. Now, you might be thinking, why in the world did they do that? Well, they were sellouts. In my personal and humble opinion, they sold out, and I can understand why, and I wasn't there, so I can't say what I would have done in that situation necessarily. But essentially, in order to kind of keep peace and to protect themselves, they in ways sold out their brothers and sisters that were still enslaved on the island. And you'll note that I haven't said that Queen Nanny signed a treaty at that point, but a year later, so 1741, She signs a treaty about the land and how much land her Maroon group will be allocated and be left alone in that allocation. And so they were given 500 acres and it was called New Nanny Town. And that was kind of at the end of the First Maroon War. It was later rebuilt, New Nanny Town, and it's called Moortown, and to this day it's called Moortown in Jamaica. And in 1781, the Assembly actually agreed to purchase another 500 acres from a neighbouring planter, Charles Douglas, and so they increased Moortown's communal land to about 1,000 acres on the island. Maroon leaders such as Cudjoe and Quow, who had agreed not to harbour new runaway slaves, but to help catch them instead for bounties, and also fight for the British in case of an attack from the French or Spanish. The British, in a sense, did well because they had made a truce with this Maroon group who were essentially irritating them. But they also were protecting their money because slaves cost money, and enslaved people running away meant that planters were losing money, and planters would have been frustrated, and planters would have been annoyed at the government for not doing more to stop these pesky Maroons. So we're going to speak a little bit about Nanny's legacy and why she's remembered the way she is, more so than her brothers are. None of them are national heroes, just to point out. And by the way, her brothers were not the only other Maroon leaders. There were other Maroon groups, and there was actually a second Maroon war with some of the Maroons in Trelawney, which is another area in Jamaica, that actually led to the deportation of some Maroons. Eventually back to Africa and to Sierra Leone by way of Canada. We'll get into that story shortly. So this extract I'm going to read is from Lionheart Gal, Life Stories of Jamaican Women, written by Sistrin, or Collated should I say, as it is a group of short stories. Sistrin is an independent women's cultural organisation which works at advancing the awareness of its audiences on questions affecting Caribbean women. Sistrin means sisters in Patois or in a Caribbean dialect, and it's developed from an initiative of working class women which started in 1977. It's best known for its theatre work, but it was among the first of a new wave of Caribbean women's organisations addressing questions of gender, class, violence, sexuality, ageing, women's history and women's work through theatre and through drama, through dance and music. I'm reading from a collection of short stories, and I would recommend the text. However, I will say it is completely in Patois, the short stories. The introduction isn't. And whilst I can understand Patois when it's spoken, reading it is a different thing, because there aren't really set grammar rules, and so you kind of have to say it in your head as if you were speaking Patois, which if you don't speak Patois or can't understand Patois, it could be confusing. However, I would still recommend this book. It's really good, and the short stories do reveal a lot about the experience of Caribbean women with different kind of oppressions in terms of like sexuality or class or age, and of course gender and race. So let's get into this extract. It's taken from the introduction, which gives the background of the kind of idea of a Caribbean woman and a stereotypical Caribbean woman in the history of the Caribbean. And so they speak about Nanny, another name for Nanny that is, as a Maroon leader of the 18th century, and her image as a warrior woman, a priestess who led the Eastern Maroons in their fight against slavery. Maroon stories tell us that she was far more militant than Cudjoe, her brother that is, who led the Western Maroons. In 1740, when she learnt he had signed a treaty with the British, she was furious and vowed to continue hostilities. Now, those hostilities, I'm assuming, were against the British, but also maybe against Cudjoe, who had signed that treaty and, as I said earlier, sold out. She did this until 1741, when she was granted a land patent in the parish of Portland, which is what I said allowed her to have those 500 acres of land, and then that was doubled to 1,000 when the land was purchased from a planter. Nee was not merely an exceptional woman. Her power was underpinned by several factors, material and cultural. It drew on the tradition of Ohima, the Ashanti Queen Mother, on the control which African women had over agriculture in Maroon society, on the specific needs of the war effort, as well as the circumstances of sexuality which existed in rebel communities of the time. Other black women drew strength from these traditions too. Cuba, for example, was to have been the Queen of Kingston, If the rebellion in which she was involved had succeeded, and the earliest Maroons of the 17th century had a Coromantee queen, the legacy of these women belongs to all Caribbean women who try to change oppressive circumstances in which they find themselves. This legacy belongs to women like those who speak in Lionheart Gal, which is the text I'm reading from. And so I think in that extract, and why I read it out, is because it links these ideas of spirituality in a way, which I think are one of the reasons why Nanny has been erased in ways from history. And you might be thinking, well, she's widely recognised in Jamaica, and that is definitely the case. But the fact that she's often dismissed as an Obia woman, Obia being known as black magic or kind of some dark spiritual ideologies, and nothing like Christianity, which is the kind of idealistic and perfect religion in Jamaica, at least. And so because she steps away from that, she was obviously not Christian, she was obviously in her mindset not colonized and still in touch with her African spiritual practices. She's often disregarded potentially as someone that is not to be necessarily a role model or a leader. She drew on the ancestors for strength. Similarly, in the Haitian Revolution, they used voodoo and their spiritual practices that they had taken from their homelands of Africa and brought with them and passed on through generations. And so this idea that, she didn't subscribe to Christianity, why would she? She wasn't, colonized mentally by the British, I think has stood in her way of being properly, truly recognized and understood. One of my favorite stories, there's two in total, but one is the fact that, she often had to find food for her Maroons that she was leading, and food was hard to come by. They are growing in the mountainous regions of Jamaica, not the most fertile land where all the plantations would have been to grow sugar, because that was the main export out of Jamaica at the time. Queen Nanny was said to have, called on the ancestors, look, we don't have any food, we don't know what to do, maybe it's time to give up. And essentially woke up the next morning with 3 pumpkin seeds in her pocket, and went out the next day and planted those pumpkin seeds, and pumpkins grew in abundance, to the point that that mountain is still called Pumpkin Hill, that area of Jamaica, because of how many pumpkins grew and were able to feed that Maroon community for a substantial period of time. That's one of the stories, and I think the fact that that's passed down and has been passed down through oral traditions historically is all the more important. And now, whilst we do write about these things, because this history is slowly finding itself into the history books and on paper, these traditional stories are still passed on in Jamaica. And I would also like to bring up another story which has its controversies, of this idea of her military prowess and her ability to catch bullets. Now, it was an art form in some African areas, in West Africa especially, in terms of their warfare and the skills that they had in that training, to catch bullets in their fingers, and obviously to stop them from shooting at someone, to catch them before that they could, make impact with a person's body. And so it was said that Nanny could do this, but it's also actually said that Queen Nanny would catch bullets in her bottom. Now, you might be thinking, how vulgar and how rude, and there is an argument and a story that it was actually the colonisers that really disliked Nanny. Obviously, she was essentially killing their men and resisting at every possible juncture, turn and corner in Jamaica. They didn't like her, and so they kind of created this crude and really vulgar rumour or story about her catching bullets in her bottom, which, when you actually think about it, is quite unlikely. Although then we bring in the ideas of spirituality and her calling on the ancestors to be able to survive and to be able to feed her people. Maybe those stories aren't so far-fetched. So, as I said, with oral traditions, we do have to leave room for discrepancies and maybe several versions of a story. And you might be thinking, oh, well, how do we know what's true? Well, to be quite honest, how do we know what's true in any historical retelling of any story, whether it be about the Caribbean or Africa or Britain? All historians have a bias, and they tell you these stories with that bias, myself included. I did mention earlier in this episode some of the Maroons that were deported back to Africa, to Sierra Leone by way of Canada. So in 1795, there was an 8-month conflict between the Maroons and the British, the Second Maroon War, led by Cujo and the Maroons of Trelawney, which is another area of Jamaica. And, this battle went on and on. Most would describe the battle to have been avoidable, and it could have been dealt with diplomatically. I won't go into the reasons why because I want to focus on the aftermath. But eventually, a treaty was signed with General George Walpole and the Maroon leaders, because the Maroons essentially had to surrender, and the treaty said that they would beg on their knees for the king's forgiveness, return all runaway slaves, and be relocated elsewhere in Jamaica. The governor ratified this treaty, however, only giving the Maroons 3 days to present themselves to beg for forgiveness. The Maroons were obviously suspicious of the British intentions. Most of the Maroons did not surrender immediately and until mid-March, some of them as late as when this was happening in January, and the conflict ended in December. So the British used this kind of breach of treaty, shall we say, as like a precedence to deport a lot of the Trelawney Town Maroons to an area called Nova Scotia. And so, General Walpole was actually, quite disgusted by what the governor did, because he had given the Maroons his word that he would not deport them off the island. Walpole actually resigns and goes back to England, and then, deals with that situation in England. However, these Maroons have been deported to Nova Scotia. Some stayed behind in Jamaica. Some of them, became free people of colour, as the term that they were known as. Some died on the voyage, and then from there they were actually transported to Sierra Leone in West Africa, because they didn't want to be in Canada. It's obviously a bitter and cold country, and Britain had just settled in Sierra Leone, and so the British government allowed them to move there, and they travelled to Freetown just at the start of the 19th century, and that is where they established themselves. So the Maroons aren't just kind of situated in Jamaica, I guess, in ways. This kind of forced migration has them in different parts of the world, as we can see from this story, which is quite a strange take, considering like Nanny's Maroons end up having their own town called Moortown. They have freedom and a free jurisdiction over their own affairs in Jamaica, separate to the Jamaican government. And so to end this episode on Queen Nanny of the Maroons, I think it's a clear example of women resisting, and a continuation on from last week's episode where we looked at other women on different parts of the transatlantic slave trade resisting the colonial powers that be. And as we can see, Queen Nanny here not only resisting the Spanish in the first and earlier days, but also the British, and refusing to sign the treaty that other Maroon leaders signed before her. And so that is why she's recognised. That is why her face is on a $500 bill. There are statues of her, her grave and the area that she is allegedly buried in Moortown is still held and regarded in the highest esteem, and she is honoured on the island as the only female national hero. And so we honour Queen Nanny of the Maroons this week in this episode, and I'm sure if anyone is listening of Jamaican descent or is Jamaican, you'll have heard so many other stories about Queen Nanny that I have not even got time to go into and mention, or may not have even heard, because it is an oral history. There are so many tales about her life and the things she did, and so I hope this episode has paid tribute to that, and you have understood another black woman resisting historically. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful week. Please follow us on the relevant Spotify, Google Podcasts or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, on Twitter, on Instagram. We are on YouTube. Please subscribe to the channel. There will be new content coming out soon whilst we post the back episodes that have already gone. Have a great week. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.